may be difficult to believe, but 40% of the revenue from hip hop and rap music comes from suburban white teenagers. Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. George Villanueva joins me in examining the hip hop culture and how it reflects and reproduces the larger commercial culture and what it tells us about the interaction between the two. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. George Villanueva from Loyola University. We're going to discuss hip-hop culture. Great. Welcome, Dr. Villanueva. I'm glad you could join us.
I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Villanueva earned his Ph.D. at USC in communication, and now he teaches classes community, race, social justice, democracy, and you have a regular class on hip-hop culture. And not too long ago, you had an article called Chi-Town Loves You, which was in the Journal of Popular Music. So I guess we can start with, it seems like something that's really academic. I mean, people watch TV, listen to music. Why are academics interested in cultural practices, kind of writ large?
Sure. I mean, as an academic who spent 15 years in working in electoral politics, I think what I realized was a lot of times culture is put on the back burner with respect to the whole idea that economics and policy creates change. But what I realized a lot was culture, really everyday culture and especially expressive culture created change. And when I moved to Chicago in 2015 to take that job at Loyola University Chicago, I was doing research on comparing equity movements between Chicago and Los Angeles from community organizers. But what I realized in Chicago was the art scene was very involved, especially the local hip hop culture in a lot of the equity movements and a lot of the social justice movements at that time. And again, 2015 at that time was when the Laquan McDonald shooting was exposed, and that the previous mayor, Rahm Emanuel, and also Police Superintendent Jerry McCarthy were running a cover-up. So there, in 2015, beyond the community organizers and the activists on the ground, kind of uncovering that and showing that this was a cover-up, a lot of the local hip-hop culture, including Vic Mensa, Chance the Rapper, Jamila Woods, and hip-hop culture and really urban kind of music culture also were participating in a lot of those movements on the ground. And I realized there was a lot of cultural movements to kind of support the activism, the social activism.
The political activism supported by the larger culture, because that's it's interesting when you talk about the hip hop culture kind of surrounding, I don't know, giving a bed for or encapsulating the larger political movement around police brutality or police killings. Which is strange because I don't think it's a stretch to say stereotypically hip hop is seen as, often seen as gangster, violence, anti-female, misogynist, vulgar, right? Drug
lacking
connected.
Substance.
Yes. So how does that, when you're looking at hip hop culture, is it just in the city of Chicago, just with a few artists like Chance the Rapper, or is this a phenomena that goes to other countries or even other cities in the United States where there's a connection?
Yeah. My class is called Hip Hop Culture, Communication, and Social Change. I do focus on Chicago as some of the examples since we live in Chicago, but the class also points to other cultures and, more importantly, the history of hip hop here in the United States. 40 years ago, in the early 70s,
in the Bronx,
and a lot of the progenitors, Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash, Kool Herc, a lot of them were throwing hip hop parties to kind of give youth alternatives to the violence that was happening around, given post-industrial New York and really the de-investment.
So they were overtly political in that sense? Or is that overstating it?
And that's the interesting thing when culture gets brought in, right? Is like how overtly political can you be, but at the same time, also how particularly in the United States, also how you can also bring in politics in cultural stuff, such as expressive culture.
In one sense, all culture is political, but
Right.
it's a different thing for the actual artists or the genre to have this. I've heard it called radical hip hop, like Public Enemy at a certain point. But
Right.
what you're talking about in the very beginning, it's a very localized production of the music. And
Right.
even the technical characteristics of the early music is different than what we might think of today. Is that
Right.
Is that valid?
And I think 4 years ago, you were almost being political, given that you weren't, especially these lower income communities of color in cities, when you're not given the access to classical music or instruments that are taught in music school. You take on everyday instruments such as the electronic turntables and so forth, and you use that as a way to not only express culture, but also express a different way to kind of be political in cities where you're not given arts resources.
You're using the tools, the material that you have at hand to create a different aesthetic appeal.
Right,
And then
aesthetic
that-
appeal and political appeal.
political
Almost goes
appeal.
hand in hand to a point.
Okay,
And
so
sometimes that happens now, obviously less so given some of the industries, particularly the culture has been commercialized to a point, but there's still that going.
well, we know we've had guests on here before, and we've talked about the consolidation of the media, and I'm assuming there's also been a consolidation of the music industry. So, part of the question is, how is it that if the hip hop begins as kind of based in a locale, it's a material response to the conditions that have an overtly political feel, how does it get the reputation of being gangster-driven, drug-connected, violence, vulgar, misogynist? How do we get from where you said it begins to where we might be partly today anyway?
Yeah, I think there's two kind of strands. I mean, first is recognizing U.S. society in general is founded on violence, especially violence against women, violence against communities of color, and the slave trade and so forth. Hip hop culture is a reflection of that society, dealing with some of those issues, but also expressing those issues with respect to not having the typical resources that, let's say, a more established, a more resource kind of musical culture or also society might have in this country. So it's kind of, hip hop gets a bad rap mainly because the U.S. society loves to blame kind of culture coming out of Black communities, Latinx communities, and so forth as being very violent because that's what they want the media and the society wants to portray. But at the same time, it doesn't also recognize that this country in itself was actually birthed out of a lot of that violence and a lot of.
Well, you might say in both cases it's a reflection of the violence in the community, so it's expressing the conditions that one finds oneself in.
Right.
At the same time, what seems to be a interest in material consumption, because many of the hip hop artists will talk about their Gucci bags or their shopping at Tiffany or the ride that they have, which is also a reflection of the larger consumer culture, all the way up to the president, that everybody wants to talk about how much money they've made and some equity investment. But in this community, the success can be measured on trinkets almost.
Right, a reflection of it, and sometimes, I mean, this is an idea of survival sometimes, and the whole idea of if I'm into Jordans or Gucci or so forth, sometimes it's also the whole idea of like, well, I haven't really grown up with much, so sometimes that maybe playing into some of that consumerism is also an idea of, well, I haven't had this in my life, so buying a trinket like that isn't a pure reflection of like, these are my overall values, but I would also argue that it's also that whole idea of expressing yourself, and sometimes turning kind of commodities into something that could potentially show resistance. I mean, hip hop has done that with music, and hip hop has done that with, graffiti to a point. That's one of the elements of hip hop culture, and it's found a way to use.
Well, the graffiti refuses to accept the norms of what's supposed to be on this building or in this hallway.
And express your own identity at the
Express
same
your
time.
own identity.
Right.
My question is, however, that I think that we might have skipped something, a strand that still exists, because you talked about the founding or the early days of hip hop that
Sure.
had a connection with the youth and a kind of an element of political resistance to the status quo, and then we get today where a reflection is with some hip hop artists, it might be called gangster rap or something like that, but there's other elements from Public Enemy or The Coup or Arrested Development, which also reflected the existing material conditions, but they had a different response. Their music made a direction in a different way, which wasn't necessarily about them as the artists, but about them as a member of a larger community.
And a collective society. And I think that's hip-hop culture in its essence, when it was starting in the 70s, was very much a collective culture, a response to really, again, not just New York, but also other major cities, just the whole idea that there's no resources for a lot of these disinvested communities, so how do we express ourselves at the same time providing alternative pathways for youth? So the traditional four elements of hip hop is turntablism, the DJing, MCing, the rapping, graffiti, and the visual culture, and also b-boying, b-girling, and breakdancing. Then eventually the fifth is knowledge, which gets to what Public Enemy, Boogie Down Productions, The Coup, a lot of them really merge all of those elements and
it seems to me that it becomes a different way of aesthetically expressing yourself that in some cases becomes overtly political because you live in a culture of inequality. If you're in the south side or the west side of Chicago, for instance. And there's one way to respond to that is to find your own individual way, however that might be. Another way to respond to that is challenge the larger social conditions that have created this, like employment, education, and the rest. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so fascinated by culture, and especially hip hop culture, because a lot of communities of color in this country have not had access to City Hall or, let's say, corporate systems as Michigan Avenue. So where do you see resistance? So whether it's overtly political or not is really at times through the everyday culture that a lot of folks are using to survive throughout in the society, especially in urban.
Well, the question of resistance and music in particular, I mean, I can think of many conditions in different countries, even in this country. If you go back to the value of gospel music during slavery, it was a form of resistance. I think there's a difference, again, between the coup and Future, because, okay, I'm going to resist because this is the way I survive in this community, but in the way I'm going to do that is get the car that's got tinted windows, and I'm going to, the bad words for women that I'm going to have in the back seat, and now I've survived. Yeah. And I understand that's resistant because it says a certain thing to the rules that be and the powers that be and the police that be. But it seems to be a very muted resistance, which is tolerable within the larger society that produces a Milliken or a Bloomberg or any other number of people that have made money in less than ethical ways. So.
Right, and I think part of and again, that's part of what makes hip hop culture, especially an interesting kind of thing to study nowadays, because it's been 40 years, and overtly political groups such as Public Enemy, The Coup, or Boogie Down Productions, we're operating in a different time where hip hop wasn't as commercialized as it is now. So I think it's difficult.
It's also before there was a black president, and before there was as many black elected officials as we have, and I don't know, I guess it was about the time Oprah shows up. So yeah, the whole cultural scene is radically different.
Right, and that's difficult to, like, Future, as much as I don't listen to Future as much, there's some aspects of his music that will resonate to some things that those overtly political groups weren't talking about, and some of that is the current kind of contemporary interest in also how mental health kind of affects a lot of these communities of color, especially when it comes to drugs or just living everyday life. When we look at hip hop in the early days, in the 80s and the early 90s, a lot of these issues that current hip hop was talking about, like mental health and really the whole idea of trying to find alternative ways to resist, weren't really talked about back then. And I think it's an interesting thing to see that there's this reckoning nowadays in hip hop culture to try to become a little bit more expansive.
My question is to what extent is that expansiveness? Again, I guess we would have to talk about specific artists. Expansiveness for their own particular gain and success as opposed to expansiveness for resolving the
For
social problems.
I'd say it's complicated.
Yeah, I'm sure it
Yeah.
is, but I think of Beyonce's Black Panther rendition at
Yeah.
the NFL halftime. That really wasn't channeling the Black Panthers, because as far as I know, no women wore hot pants and boots and
Yeah.
danced around like that. And she was criticized for that, but it seemed to me that seemed to be a very clever marketing strategy to attract attention without actually suggesting breakfast for children programs or equality in education or the end of police brutality, which was not the theme of her thing, but she played upon that. She
Yeah.
took something from that era and brings it forward so it's culturally acceptable, not just to the black community, but
Right, and I don't think she would ever argue that she was even trying to be that political. It's similar to our, the similar discussion of how maybe Bernie Sanders, as much as he's not a complete socialist.
he's not a hip hopper.
And, but it's also the whole idea that sometimes movements open up different pathways where you can bring some stuff to the table to start talking about.
Right.
So even if Beyonce and Jay-Z aren't the most overtly political hip hop culture characters, there's always the whole idea of opening up space for the potential that other acts.
Well, that's the next question, and I know we talk about social media as kind of revolutionizing the ability to reach people, but leaving that aside, the other thing that's happened since the early days of hip hop and even that political radical strand is the consolidation of the music industry. Mm-hmm. Many of these labels, many of these artists may independently write their music, but they don't independently market or decide what's going to be cut and what's going to be distributed. Can you share a little bit of that? What the music industry looks like in terms of hip hop? I mean,
yeah, I think in 2017, Forbes put out an article talking about how hip hop and urban R&B had become the biggest sellers worldwide. So the industry, the music industry, knows hip hop culture and also R&B, particularly obviously non-white kind of strands of it are very popular and very lucrative. So you get industries wanting to obviously control.
So that'd be like Sony, it's Columbia Records.
Sony, Columbia, MCA. They're all into it, and the streaming systems. They know they make a lot of money off all this stuff as well. Music, making money off music is then dying. It's actually increasing with these stream plays.
So does that affect what the public will hear? Will that affect
by far. It always affects.
Yeah.
It affects it at the mass level. But what I'm particularly interested in hip hop culture is what's going on from the more local levels, and you see the localized versions kind of supporting kind of community and place and so forth. Whether they become national big acts is always going to be questioned because
they won't do that unless they sign with a big label, most likely.
But there's also a lot of artists who are trying to find ways not to sign with big labels and still kind of spread their music. I mean, Chance the Rapper is an example. Even though he's signing more and more with labels now. I mean, he got his start from really building an audience first and building it
Chicago,
through,
Chicago.
and also building it through social media channels and streaming services. But so I think artists today have much more different accesses, but they have to be deliberate if they want to be political.
Yeah.
So I'm encouraged because I think there's a lot of young folks who are also blending hip hop culture with other musical genres and also being very very conscious about it. I think.
Well, if you live in the world, if you live in Chicago or any other major city, your experience is not going to be one of hopefulness that you're going to be able to become an immediate hip hop artist discovered on American Idol, and it may lead some to participate in what you were talking about Chicago with Laquan McDonald. And actually, I'd like you to talk about that because it's one of the questions that arises. To what extent can hip hop be progressive as opposed to being vulgar and self-serving for the particular artist? How does hip hop contribute? And one of the things you said in your Chi-Town Loves You article is that the Chicago artists challenged the status quo in Chicago and helped activism in Chicago. So I wonder what that was. How did the Chance the Rapper or others, how did that actually assist in protesting police brutality and conditions?
I think a lot of it is giving a bullhorn or a platform to a lot of those issues are going. And so like someone like Vic Mensa, who comes out with 16 Shots, which is completely based on the Laquan McDonald shooting, or Chance the Rapper going on Saturday Night Live, mentioning Jason Van Dyke, who was a police officer who shot Laquan McDonald, actually mentioning my name and getting that out into the public.
So they were doing what some athletes have done about racism, like Colin Kaepernick,
and
LeBron
so
James,
forth.
and others, and they were using their success to
following in the tradition. Let's say, I mean, Bill Russell did that. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did that. A lot of, Nina Simone did that. I mean, as a musician, so a lot of really following on the history of a lot of Black activism in this country with regard to really showing and demonstrating what are the oppression, but also using your platform to also promote social justice, which I think is what hip hop has done for 40 years, but also doesn't really get a lot of credit to actually, with respect to how influential it's been.
It probably depends on who gets to own and who gets to define hip hop.
Right.
And if hip hop is being defined by late night TV or the news media, or even if hip hop's being defined by Sony Records or MCA
or Dolores Tucker.
Yeah, it's gonna be a different way. And even for some of the hip hop artists themselves, it's like, I don't care, there's nothing in it for me, I need more. That's not exactly the only definition or only possibility for hip hop. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's strands, and hip hop just as a genre by itself per se is not necessarily progressive, but it's also not necessarily reactionary. It's reflective, but then after that and expressive, but after that it kind of needs to be unpacked.
Actually, Imani Perry writes this book about called Prophets of the Hood, and calls hip hop not liberatory, or it's not a tool for liberation on itself, but it's really about whether artists can also put on their agenda and actually make it a liberatory practice. And
it would seem like music would have more than sports, for example, or more than actors, because when you're a sports figure, you're playing your sport. It's kind of, there's the rules, that's what you're doing. If you're an actor or actress, you're reading the script. But if you're a musician, you get to make your lyrics. You get to decide to some extent.
Maybe. I wouldn't say, I mean, again, we're operating, music has its own media and cultural industry. So there's producers who are always who are looking over your shoulder, whether artists are given free rein to just express whatever they express. Especially if they're signed to a label.
Well, I guess they could, but they don't get to have their music distributed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're free to do what you want. You just can't do it with my label.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and I think that's the important part to also highlight, is that the larger structure of the industries put some restraints on individual artists, just like in acting or in sports and so forth. So we're seeing there are some parallels there. So.
Is there connections between hip-hop culture or hip-hop as a genre and the expression of the material conditions or the reflection of their life? Would you say you could find similar things with other genres? I know you're not teaching punk or country, but could you make the same?
Yeah, I would. I like making, actually, because I like making, when I teach my class, I like pointing to how hip-hop has grown out of jazz and gospel as genres, and pointing to how those musical genres also made similar political kind of statements through the music, but also how, especially punk grew up at the same time that hip hop grows up, and also
punk has a different, I don't know, a location. I mean, where does punk as a genre begin? I mean, I don't know. I think of Seattle and white people. I don't know.
Place-wise?
Yeah.
There's also Thatcher, UK. There's also Reagan. I mean, obviously, there's all these. Post-industrial America kind of gives birth to punk and hip hop, because
so did punk and hip hop,
the social welfare state is disappearing.
Would you have would they play in the same location?
I think so. Yeah, if you look at like bands like Bad Brains, who were already in DC mixing punk and hip hop, there's been a lot of that cross section, similar to. The Rolling Stones going to Aretha Franklin, her gospel concert, and
I think again there's stereotypes. I think of punk, I think of skinheads, and I think of fairly white culture. Where I don't think of black punk like I don't think of white hip hop.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
again,
a lot
that's
of
it.
a
But
lot of
there
white
are,
punk was political back in the day.
Oh,
And,
yeah,
and there was a lot
yes.
of also anti-racist kind of punk,
Right.
not only from black punk artists, but also white punk artists, right? So
Yeah.
I think again, I mean, partly getting back to your previous question, why culture becomes important. Culture is a place where we can look at resistance and politics, but a lot of times,
and the adjustment, the resistance, and then there's a response by the status quo, and your resistance may not quite be as resisting as it was before because there's been some accommodation for it. So, yeah. But the culture is a good place to start because it reflects what we're doing and the material we're living with. So,
yeah. I think it should be the first place to start, but a lot of times, again, we give so much attention to economics and politics because in this country, the bottom line is always money, right?
Money.
So
well, the bottom line here is we're at the end of our time.
Yeah, exactly.
We could talk for some more, but that's really all the time we have. So thank you, George Villanueva, joining me today on the Roundtable. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.